Hey guys, KiramidHead here. I'm starting this episode a little differently than I usually do because I recorded the whole thing and then sat down and realized I had forgotten to do the plugs I normally do at the beginning of an episode because it's been a while since I did one. Oops. So, gonna get that out of the way here real quick before the public domain theme music. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, if you like this podcast and you like similar subject matter, check out the Shelved Film Podcast. I'll put a link to his page down below. As well as I just have been in contact with a similar but incredibly differently formatted podcast called the Table Reads Podcast, and I will link their site down below. Give them a little shout out, give them a little help, because that's a very fun thing they do. They basically live read and live react to the scripts. Like, they don't read them ahead of time. They do it. They go in almost completely blind. So yeah, that's a fun thing to do. And also, if you like the show, check us out on Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, and Blogger. Those links will be down below. So now that I've, finished correcting my fuck up, to the regular show, guys. Let's get to that. Alright everyone, hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I am your host KiramidHead, and tonight I am bringing you a solo episode. This was supposed to be with a co-host, but we ran into some scheduling issues. Like, we were about to do it and then some crazy personal shit went down in his life, and it's the kind of thing where it's like, I understand why he's not able to do it. But this was supposed to be the first episode of what I was calling on Twitter the countdown to Dark Phoenix, and in fact I was actually calling it that in the opening of the next episode that's supposed to go up, which I started recording early. And the idea was that I would get this one out and put up, and I would start working on the rest of that one. But everything kind of got out of whack, and now it's more like aftermath of Dark Phoenix. So if you hear me say that in the next episode and you didn't listen to this one, that's why. But tonight, the script I'm going to be talking about is X-Men Origins Magneto, or just Magneto, written by Sheldon Turner. And I say that because this draft doesn't have a title page. But there apparently is like a hard copy draft. I saw someone talk about them having, apparently the title on it was just X-Men Origins, which is confusing. And what this one is this was one of those X-Men Origins movies where they were going to do a spin-off movie for a single character, and they were going to put it under the X-Men Origins umbrella, and we only ever got one of those, which was X-Men Origins Wolverine. And it seems like this was the only other one they're ever officially doing, because I've heard rumblings and rumors online about how, like, the third one was going to be Deadpool, or the third one was going to be Storm. I've not seen anything concrete about that, but the Deadpool script was being written around the time that they were still talking about doing, this X-Men Origins thing, because basically the movie Deadpool we got was written way back then. It just took 6 years for them to finally get it made and out because of the way things were at Fox. But the overall plot of this script is that it follows Eric Lencher, or as he would come to be known, Magneto, as he is surviving in the camp at Auschwitz in the 40s. It follows him, from there, where he's being experimented on by the scientist called Dr. Kleinmine. It follows him, from that through to the liberation, and him trying to start a normal life in the Ukraine and start a family, but then that goes to hell, and he ends up basically on the warpath, going to he goes to South America to hunt some Nazis, and as it goes along as him hunting Nazis and trying to find Dr. Kleinmine and the people who tormented him personally, he meets Charles Xavier for the first time, and that relationship forms, and they end up, coming together to fight what ends up being, the bad guy plot, so to speak, of this movie. Although this isn't really so much a superhero movie, it's much more a very bleak, character-focused drama, which I like about it. Now, I'm gonna go into the background of this a little briefly, just because when we I'll say in the next episode, which I already recorded, so I'm kind of thinking of it as the previous episode. Me and Deus Deacon went into the X-Men movies ad nauseum in that Wolverine episode we did back in 2016, so I just don't really feel like doing that again. Like, I'm kind of rolling my eyes thinking about talking about Batman background during the next couple of the next few Batman things I have left to talk about. So yeah, I'm even So I'm not quite to that level that I am with X-Men, because I've only done a handful of X-Men episodes. Well, one that's been published so far, but I'm working on a few right now. But basically, talking about it and through the lens of Magneto, is that Magneto was always a very cool villain in the movies. Even when he was arguably acting out a character in X3, like, he still had a memorable performance from Ian McKellen. And he was an interesting villain because they wrote him in such a way where you totally understand his perspective on events. You get just that brief little prologue in Auschwitz, which, by the way, is a ballsy way for a superhero movie to open, especially in 2000, when the last major superhero movie we had gotten really was Batman and Robin. Like, sure, you had Blade, which was a success, but was kind of an under-the-radar sort of thing, and a lot of people didn't even know it was a Marvel comic at the time. And, of course, you had Steel, but no one gives a shit about Steel. So, yeah, it's just the fact that this was the first major big-hit superhero movie to come out post-Batman and Robin, and it opens with a scene set at Auschwitz. Now, it's not graphic, it's not like Schindler's List or anything, but it's still a ballsy move to do that. And it just inserts in your mind just the motivation for Magneto without having to go into any more detail. And it's a really great sort of introduction to the character. And I like how his plan in that first movie is kind of benign in a sense. Like, he doesn't so much want to destroy humanity or enslave humanity so much as he wants to make their leaders into mutants themselves and make them more sympathetic towards the mutant cause, which is a really interesting idea. And then you see him sort of evolve into the second movie where he gets a lot more ruthless than he was. And then in the third movie, his point that he's making about the mutant cure is a very, salient, very interesting point that he's making, very, very understandable point that he's making, even though he's really evil and like cartoonish and that and kind of out of character, especially compared to the first two movies. Like, the pawns go first thing is really shitty and out of character for him. And him just abandoning Mystique felt kind of out of character as well, because that was writing around scheduling and stuff, so they got kind of lazy with the plotting and characterization there. He later, when, of course, the character came back with Michael Fassbender in First Class, and that kind of... I'll go into this a little bit more detail later when I talk about what happened to this project, because some things from this script kind of ended up there, depending on who you ask. It either did get folded into that movie or it didn't. It all depends on who you ask, like I said. But Fassbender's a great Magneto. He walks away with that movie, and that's nothing against the rest of that cast, because McAvoy's brilliant, and I like Jennifer Lawrence and Nicholas Hoult a lot, and the rest of the First Class is pretty good in that. And Kevin Bacon's a great bad guy, but Magneto and Fassbender just completely walk away with First Class. And, it eventually got redressed with McAvoy completely walking away with Days of Future Past. But yeah, he's great in that. I think he's great in both McKellen and Fassbender are wonderful in Days of Future Past. I don't like what they do with him in Apocalypse at all. I think it feels weird and out of character, and they don't do enough to really justify that in the movie. Like, I don't buy that the guy who was, like, besieging the White House and, like, threatening to kill Nixon on live TV is just going to give up and go live in Poland somewhere and have a family and live in peace. It's all so that they can do this character arc and give Fassbender, like, dark shit to work with and give him, like, a reason for why he's siding with Apocalypse. When really, when you think about it, the guy who believes in mutant supremacy should have no problem siding with Apocalypse. But they had to give him the emotional arc, which just didn't work for me. And the fact that he willingly participates in attempted genocide, and then Xavier just lets him walk the fuck away at the end, also offers him a place with the X-Men. It's like, really, Charles? Really? Are you sure about that? And then we get to Dark Phoenix, which just came out. And I have to say about that movie, it wasn't as bad as I went into it expecting after hearing, like, reviews and people talk about it and stuff, but it wasn't very good. But Fassbender was pretty cool in it, and that last scene, there's, like, a scene towards the end of him and McAvoy, which is perfect. Other than that, the movie's just kind of meh. The whole, splitting into factions over do we kill Jean or do we try and save her ended up being completely pointless because it just fizzles out after like 10 minutes. It felt like 10 minutes. It might have been longer, but it felt like it was barely even introduced into the movie as a concept, and then it just gets dropped and they're on a train fighting together, and like McAvoy talks to him for like 5 minutes or like more like 30 seconds, and then like it's completely like they're just completely on their sided with each other again. There's a lot of problems with that movie. It was not the worst thing in the world. I'd say of the lesser X-Men movies, it's kind of at the top of the pile for me, but that's not really saying a whole lot considering how many issues I have with Apocalypse, Last Stand, and Origins. I put it above those movies, but I don't think it's one of the good or even passable X-Men movies. It's just meh. So yeah, getting into this script, the history of this script is basically that, okay, after X2, Fox started toying around with the idea of doing, character-based spin-off movies, and it was something that they were even more committed to after The Last Stand because they realized these movies were getting more expensive because getting all the actors together, they kept getting higher paychecks with every movie. So hey, let's do these smaller movies to avoid having to do an X-Men 4. But yeah, before that, I believe I read an article where this was reported in December of 2004 where basically they had already, decided they were going to do Wolverine, which is an obvious choice because he's a real popular character. And that's a whole story, which if you want to know more about that, go to the Wolverine episode I did. And then they brought in Sheldon Turner, who was a hot writer at the time, and he had written a few things, and I've not seen a whole lot of the stuff he's written. I've heard more about him than I've seen anything he's done. I know there was that whole controversy over Up in the Air where he wrote an early draft and then Jason Reitman and his writing partner came in and they wrote their version, but Turner ended up getting credit and Reitman was pissed off about that, and so they had to share the stage at the Oscars, and if you look up the footage, they're visibly pissed off at him. I don't know what the real story is there with that. But the story is that in 2004, they hired him on and they gave him a list of characters to choose from, and he immediately picked Magneto. And in interviews surrounding this, Sheldon Turner has actually said he described this project as X-Men meets The Pianist. The Adrian Brody movie set during World War II, and it's a real bleak drama, which he won an Oscar for, and I still have never seen despite owning the DVD. Strange. And when I first read this back when I was a teenager, I went, that sounds like the guy's just bullshitting and making it sound more sophisticated than it actually is, and having read the script now, and I've read this a few times now, it's probably one of my favorite unproduced superhero scripts. He's not wrong. This actually is a pretty bleak character-based drama, and that's what I like about it. And another thing I want to say about Sheldon Turner is he is an incredibly prolific writer. He has sold something like 50 scripts in the time he's been writing. It's crazy. Even some pretty well, respected writers haven't done that in the short amount of time he has. There's just a huge amount of stuff he's written. It's crazy. But so yeah, getting into the script, it opens with it has a framing device, which is said it's at the ceremony at, the location of where the Auschwitz camp was, which is dedicated to the 60th anniversary of the liberation. And, you have all these people gathered around, including, political figures and survivors and whatnot. And Eric Lenscher, aka Magneto, is walking through a crowd, and he comes upon an iron gate. And he looks at it, and it triggers his memories, and he flashes back to 1944, and we see the gate torn to pieces and bent in the aftermath of the opening of X-Men 1. I like this framing device. I do have a few problems of it when we come back to it, but it's not a bad way to set this up, and I'll say this right now, it's actually taking place before X-Men 1, so even this part's a prequel. And I like the fact that this is here because since this is supposed to be part of the same franchise as the first three movies, it gives a moment to put Ian McKellen in the movie and sort of anchor it within that franchise. And which reminds me of the fact that when they first announced this, in fact, years after this, around the time of X-Men Origins Wolverine came out, McKellen was talking about this and saying, he wanted to play Magneto in the whole movie using the de-aging technology that they used in the first scene of X-Men: The Last Stand. Now, at the time, that may have seemed like a good idea because it actually works reasonably okay in that movie, especially for 2006. It works way better on McKellen than it does on Patrick Stewart, who, in hindsight, just looks weird. But at the time, it looked good. Looking back on it and having seen the stuff we've done with sort of digital de-aging since then, we've only really, finally started, getting that done right in the last 5 years or so. And later on, McKellen eventually said, he's not going to do it because he's too old. And my theory is that he was really hyped to do it. And then he saw the fucking ending of X-Men Origins Wolverine with fucking plastic mannequin Patrick Stewart showing up at you. And he went, yeah, no, this isn't going to work. Nope. And just noped out of it. So even if he wouldn't play Magneto through the whole thing, he would still have this opening here to sort of, anchor this film and the rest of the series, which I think it's a good move either way. And so we move into the Auschwitz portion of the story, and the 14-year-old Eric is dragged off into a laboratory building, and he's brought before a group of Nazi surgeons, and this is just really creepy and surreal the way this is described, as these surgeons just standing over him, looking at him silent. And they're led by this guy called Dr. Kleinmein, whom, reading it this time around, all I was picturing was Toby Jones for some reason, and I swear it's not just because of Winter Soldier, but he's looking over Eric, and he wants to know how Eric did what he he did, and he tells him his parents are dead. And, these horrible experiments are performed on him off camera, and we can hear his screaming, basically. And there's like a fade in time in the hall where it's like we're in the hallway, and then like it jumps ahead an indeterminate amount of time, and Eric is let out because they've not learned anything from him. And he passes a room full of Kleinmein's other experiments, including a pair of twins with artificially blonde hair and dyed blue eyes. And that's a reference to actual experiments that I believe Dr. Mengele did perform in Auschwitz, but tended to kill the children tend to kill the people he did it to instead of actually working. And I specifically point these two guys out because they come back later. And so we get to him, Eric's in the dining hall, and he's staring into a bowl of soup, and he meets this young gypsy girl who's also interned there named Magda, and he sees an SS guard named Kirkin, and I'm probably butchering the German pronunciations here, pardon me, abusing a prisoner, and he unconsciously causes his spoon to move across the table, which I don't know if he notices. I can't recall if he notices at this point, but some other prisoners, they start repeating rumors of the Russians being only a week away. To which, I think another one responds that will only make the Germans kill them faster. And this cuts to just this happening with a group of prisoners are being taken out to get shot as this air raid siren's blaring. And Eric uses his powers to keep a guard named Decker from executing anyone, delaying just long enough from the Russian army to arrive. And he actually crunches the helmet around his head. And he doesn't kill him like he does to those guys in First Class, but it is a, I'm losing my words here, but it is a very similar visual idea. And so this whole idea of him being experimented on and, in the camp, that is something that ends up in First Class. It could be a coincidence, but Kleinmein's not a mutant. He's just a horrible human being. And the last image is him laying on the ground looking up and seeing Magda. And so it then cuts to, and you can hear the Russians arriving. And it cuts to 10 years later, and Eric and Magda, they have a daughter named Anya, and they're living near a village named Valin in the Ukraine. And it's either on a river or on the Black Sea or somewhere, because there's mentions of fishermen and a waterfront, but that's never specified. And he's working on a construction crew, and they're reconstructing the village after it was partially destroyed in the war. And the rest of the workers, they're put off by how much more quickly he works, which he manages by surreptitiously using his powers. Like there's a bit where you see like nails getting driven in by themselves and whatnot, but they don't know he has powers or anything. They just don't like the fact he's a better worker than he is. And they also are put off by the fact that he's Jewish, and we see that he has a Star of David around his neck. And he buys a ratty little stuffed animal for Anya, and she tells him that the kids in school mock her for being different, and Eric tells her that being different makes her better. And I like that because that is totally just the seeds of his philosophy about mutant superiority towards humans. You're seeing the person he became, even during this nice, sort of relatively peaceful interlude he has here with his family. I completely lost my words there. You can see those ideas taking root even when he's still, trying to lead the good normal life before he loses it completely. And I like that. I like that the things that make Magneto have always been there, and that it just takes a certain sequence of events in his life to make him into a supervillain. What makes him that person is always there. It just has to be triggered by something. I think that's really good writing. And we get a dinner sequence follows where Magda is like, she gets up from the table to do something, and then Anya goes, "The trick, Daddy, the trick," and he moves like a cup across the table or a fork or something. And so we get the idea that he's told her about his abilities, but he hasn't told his wife. And we get this scene, and we get a call back to them looking at the soup in the camp where he says they don't eat soup and they'll never eat it again. And then Eric, he has trouble sleeping thanks to dreams of what happened to him, and he tries to tell Magda about his powers, but she thinks he's just talking about his anger about what happened in the camps. And the next morning, Eric takes his family to show them a plot of land, which he has bought to build a proper home for them on. And he says, "I'm good with construction," blah, blah, blah. It's like a bit of a joke. And so later that day, after finishing his work, also there's a scene where Magda is painting. She's an artist, and she can only paint pictures of the camp and the horrible things she's seen because they're just etched into her mind. That's a good scene. But, after his work, Eric stops in the village pub for a meal, and he sees Kirkin, the SS guard, sitting at the bar. He confronts him and gets into a fight, and Kirkin lets slip something about the Fourth Reich being everywhere, right before Eric, just sort of randomly lashing out his abilities, not really knowing what he's doing, puts a steak knife in his back. And sickened by his actions, Eric stumbles out into the square and collapses. And so he comes to, he sees a plume of smoke in the air. Fearing the worst, he runs for home only to find a mob. I wrote re-mob, I don't know what that means in my notes, has set it on fire, and he hears his wife and daughter screaming from within. Now I have a question about this. He walks outside the bar, and the way it's described, it sounds like he collapses right outside the bar. Yet the angry mob completely bypasses him and goes for the wife and child. I'm not quite sure that makes complete sense. Yeah, it's a little wonky the way it's written. And he's at first held back by the mob, but then he unconsciously hurls a pole and impales this guy's head, and he runs for the burning house, and like the mob just scatters at this point, basically. He runs for the burning house, and it collapses, and, the screams abruptly stop, and he freezes, staring at his daughter's stuffed animal on the front step, and and the way it's described, he's just sitting there staring for a prolonged amount of time. And then he heads to the town square, and it cuts to black, and we don't see what happens yet. We get a bit of a flashback to it later, but I won't go into it yet. So yes, I have to talk about this sequence in relation to X-Men Apocalypse, because Simon Kinberg in his script basically cannibalizes this sequence wholesale for that movie, for the whole overdramatic motivation for why Magneto joins Apocalypse. And it's so much better here. Like, I feel like it makes so much more sense for a guy who hasn't set himself on the road to be Magneto yet, for this to be one of the things that pushes him in that direction, as opposed to he is so determined that he lays siege to the White House and tries to kill Nixon on live TV, and then just gives up, finds a family, and then they go after him, rightly so, because he's a wanted fucking terrorist and murderer, and then they die on accident, and then he goes, why? And it's like, it's just really clumsily written and doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me in the context of that movie, whereas here it makes total sense to me. And it's not a stupid accident where they somehow both get shot to death with the same arrow on accident. It was really clumsy and silly looking in the movie. Like, it was constantly kind of laughable. And it didn't even make any sense why they detained the daughter in the woods in that movie either, if they're going after him. It's like, really? You just snatched the daughter and stood there in the woods and waited for him to show up? Like, come on, really? I'm sorry. I don't want this to turn into a shitting on Apocalypse thing, because I'm going to have to do that a little bit in another X-Men script that's coming up. Not one of the team scripts, really, but one of the other spin-off I'm going to be doing, which is Gambit, because that kind of ties into Apocalypse a little bit, and I'm going to have to rant about Apocalypse a little there, too. But yeah, I mean, I'm only bringing it up because it's relevant to the scripts and what they're doing. And so it cuts to 11 months later, and Eric is shown praying the Kaddish, which is the Jewish prayer of mourning in a synagogue. And he's talking to the rabbi, saying, I've done everything I'm supposed to do, but it's brought me no comfort. And, the rabbi says, it's supposed to be for edification, not comfort. And that's something I like about this script, is that in the movies and even in the comics, it's kind of the fact that Magneto was Jewish is kind of glossed over. And even in First Class really only touches on it briefly when you see that, his happy memory is his mother lighting the menorah. And I like but this script really delves into that and his religion and stuff like that. Like, Apocalypse has the scene where he looks up at the sky and goes, is this what I am to you? Which doesn't really work because it was never really established much aside from that happy memory. So it's a little weird that he suddenly has like this religious. But I like how this really just dives into Eric's, his Jewish identity and his struggling with faith. Like, it's not too deep, but I like the fact that it's here. And he steps out the door and it reveals him to be in Paris. And it actually says like the Eiffel Tower's in the background, so we don't need like text on the screen saying he's in Paris. I'm like, yes, I like that, because that annoys me so much in movies where they throw up text on the screen to tell you where you are. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure people know what the New York skyline looks like. Hellboy is the worst for that, because every time they cut the first Hellboy, I love the first Hellboy, but this bugs the shit out of me every time I watch it. Every single time they cut back to the BPRD building, even though we've seen it 15 times by now, tell you that it's the BPRD building. Like, we don't need to know that. We've already seen it the first time we got here. But okay, yeah, that's a minor point. I don't need to dwell on it. And so he heads to the School of Foreign Policy, where he attends a lecture held by a well-known Nazi hunter named Professor Noah Weisenthine. I'm going to fuck this up. He's not in the script for very long, so he then catches up to Weisenthine after the lecture and says he wants to know how to hunt Nazis and where to look. And I like this scene because he uses a very subtle usage of his powers, like he makes a metal garbage can tip over and block the guy's way so he can catch up to him. That's a good moment. And that's another thing I like about this, is that except for one moment, which I'll point out later, the uses of his powers are relatively subtle and down to earth, which I think is good for a movie with this sort of tone. And so, he wants to know how to hunt Nazis, where to look for them. And so they go to his Wiesenthal. He tells him to leave the hunting to the professionals, but allows him to come back to his office where he's eating spaghetti or something. And Eric is looking at some pictures on the wall, and he spots Decker, but not Kleinmein. And Wiesenthal says that Kleinmein is a ghost and that no one knows where he is. He offers him the card of a doctor in Israel to ask for psychiatric help. Hint, hint, that's an important thing for later. But Eric just tosses the card into his pocket without looking, and he surreptitiously uses his powers to make, Wiesenthal's plate, flip up and spill the food into his lap. And while he leaves the room to go clean himself off, he just takes the pictures and files and leaving before the guy comes back. And Wiesenthal comes back into the room. He sees that the filing cabinets have all been rifled through, and there was not enough time for that to have happened. So yet another subtle, interesting use of super. And so it cuts, and now Eric is in Buenos Aires tracking a Nazi called Otto Reiner, who is now working as a bank president, and he lifts a coffee cup to check for fingerprints and uses his powers to do this, and I'm like, is there any metal inside a coffee cup? I'm not really sure that makes any sense. But he takes his findings, he matches, the fingerprints on it to those in his file. He takes his findings to the local police, but it's made clear they won't really be doing anything. And throughout all these scenes, he's being followed by this guy who's called a handsome man who's just following him around the city, and who saw him move the coffee cup too. And he finds some kids bullying a chubby kid, scares them off, and he tells the chubby kid to do it because they fear him. Once again, that Magneto philosophy coming through. And the handsome man is sitting on top of a car just smiling at him during this scene, and Eric has this look on his face like, what the fuck, I'm assuming. And so that night at his hotel room, he's perusing articles about the doctor in Israel that was recommended to him. Eric is startled by a knock at the door. And so he finds the handsome man who introduces himself as Owen Graves and offers to buy him a drink. They talk in a nightclub where Graves reveals that he's with the CIA, and that he wants Eric to work with him as an off-the-books Nazi hunter because they're not allowed to do things, officially, so they have to, bring in outside people to do it, is what he says. And so Eric refuses the offer, and he realizes that Graves only wants him because he's expendable, and they can get rid of him if they need to. They can cut him loose if it's necessary. And so they're still in the club, and Eric spots the banker partying, and he lures the banker into an alley with a steel ball bearing. Once again, subtle power uses. He binds his arms with a bent metal bar. He takes the banker to the U.S. Embassy and attempts to hand him over, but this only gets the embassy security force made up of Marines to try and take him. But he foils them with his powers in different ways. He's using there's one of those, what are those things that you use to divide up waiting lines? They're like velvet, but they have metal things at the end and they're strung between poles. The fuck are those things called? They're strung between stanchions, I think is what they're called. And he uses the metal to trip up the Marines, and he does other stuff like that. And so he flees into an adjoining alley where he's nearly caught before Graves arrives in a Jeep and helps him escape, like that scene in Mask of the Phantasm where Andrea shows up in her car and helps Batman, kind of like that. And so they meet to discuss things in a warehouse where Graves shows Eric pictures of Nazis that he's looking for and explains that they can't act directly because the people in government of Argentina aren't in favor of American government operating down there, and that it's the legacy of, the fascist dictator Juan Perón is still very much in vogue there. And he shows Eric a headshot of a Nazi named Grubowski who headed up medical experiments at Dachau. Eric isn't interested, but Graves says he'll help him find his specific Nazis if he takes out others for him. Now, this seems kind of odd in that Eric seems very gung-ho about just finding Nazis. He goes after this banker guy that doesn't seem to have anything to do with Kleinmein, but then now he's like, oh, I only want specific Nazis. Really, Eric? I get that the idea is that he really is more vengeance driven than anything else, but I'm not really sure it adds up considering he was trying to get this Reiner guy. But I also like the idea that he is trying to take these guys down through legitimate means. He's not just a straight up murderer like he is in First Class and a lot of these. It's not fully a revenge thing, he does believe in justice, but I like the fact that it's complicated is basically what I'm saying. And so, and then on top of that, Graves shows him a picture of Decker saying the two are known associates. And so that immediately interests Eric and Grubowski again. And so Eric asks for information on Kleinmein and Graves says he'll look into it. And then Eric confronts Grubowski as now lurking as a children's dentist. And this whole thing is what I like about this scene is that there's nothing outwardly sinister about what's going on. He's just being really nice and cheerful to his child patients, but because we know he was a Nazi who partook in medical experiments, it makes it creepy with that context. It's a very interesting scene. And so he interrogates him using his powers to strangle him with a stethoscope, asking him where Decker is. Then he refuses and pulls a gun from a drawer, and it's like, oh, is he going to shoot Eric? But no, he commits suicide with it because he says, I can't say anything against them. They will come after me. It doesn't matter where I end up. And in that same drawer, Eric finds a stack of letters with the same return address on them. Now, I have to point this out. It is awfully convenient that his first day out hunting Nazis, Eric finds just going after the one guy who has, the information that will lead him to Decker. It's a bit convenient, but I understand why they do it, and I'll get to that in a bit. And so Eric, we get to see him walking down the street wearing the hat we see him in his out of uniform scenes in the other X-Men movies. And I have to say, I love the fact that there is no overdramatic origin story for where he got his hat. He just has a hat. This isn't fucking Batman Zero Year where we have to have a melodramatic origin story for why Jim Gordon wears a trench coat. Fuck off with that shit. But, okay, so Eric just decided he liked the look of this hat, and so he bought a hat, is the only thing I can assume. But he goes to meet with Graves again, who gives an update on Klein Mine. He says that information is scarce, but they have an alleged autopsy report saying that he died of pneumonia in Belarus. And of course, Eric is suspicious. He doesn't quite buy into that. And Graves hands him a dossier on another target, but Eric leaves without it. And he drives a car from the passenger seat, using his powers to drive the car while he navigates. Little flashier than the other stuff he does, but I'll take it. And he finds an old estate at the address from the letters, and he sneaks around fighting Nazi paraphernalia and gets spotted by a guard, and he has a quick, brutal fight with. And they're fighting, and the guy's kind of dominating him a little bit, and then he smiles, and Eric sees he has braces. And then Eric smiles back, and it cuts to outside, and you just hear the guy scream. It's like, oh, I love that. That's just such a brutal version of this. And this script is pretty dark and pretty violent in a few places. It feels really bloody. It feels like an R-rated Magneto movie. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of the Logan of Magneto movies, the Eric, so to speak. Okay, that was not worth the chuckle burst. That wasn't that funny. And so the commotion attracts other guards, but Eric manages to hide, and he sees two soldiers carrying crates to a pair of jeeps over by the stables that are on the grounds, and he sees Decker there. And so he steps out into the open, catching the attention of those guys, and Decker doesn't recognize him at first. And then Eric uses his powers to pull the pins from a crate full of grenades, causing utter chaos. He guts a soldier, which they say is his first intentional kill. And in the midst of all this, Decker, now recognizing Eric after he's used his powers, gets a drop on Eric and wounds him before escaping in a helicopter. Now, the whole first intentional kill thing, I'm like, was the guy who he shoved the pole through his head, was that really unintentional? Are we sure about that? The knife in the pub, I get. I'm not sure if that's unintentional, especially when we see what he did after that scene, after the cut to black later on. I'm not sure this whole first intentional murder quite adds up. And he also says during this scene, tell me what you did to me, and this is the beginning of the plot thread where he thinks that his powers were the results of the experiments that were performed on him in the camp, and I'm not sure I buy into that either, that he would think that considering his powers manifest when he bends the gate, so did he just forget about the gate entirely? I'm not really sure about that. And so during the fight, the stables burst open, horses start running all over the place, and Eric calms one only to see that its eyes have been artificially turned blue, which is very creepy. Also, this is the first use of horses in an X-Men movie, which we'll later see in Logan, and horses actually come back, and it involves Xavier in that point, so Logan connections. I don't know if that's intentional, I doubt it. And so he enters the stables, and he finds an entrance to an underground bunker, which contains a more advanced version of the labs at Auschwitz. And he also finds a box full of passports, including ones for Kleinmine, revealing him to be alive and living under the name of Albert Feynman. Also in the box is a map of Israel along with travel brochures, and there's specific places marked out on Israel, so the idea is that they're either operating in Israel or they have targets in Israel that they're planning on attacking. And word of the attack at the estate and presumably Grabowski's death reaches Washington, where CIA Deputy Director Holden is brought before the Congressional Subcommittee on War Crimes, headed up by a young first-term congressman named Robert Kelly. Now, this is a little outside. This is the first, continuity-based thing I have an issue with in this script, and it's really the only one. Hugely so, at least, is that I'm not really sure if the Kelly we see in the first three X-Men movies, which are supposed to take place basically in the mid-2000s somewhere, if he's really old enough to be this guy who's a young first-term congressman in 1955, because it goes from the 44, which is the Auschwitz scenes, to 55, 55, which is Ukraine. I believe it skips ahead to 56 by the time it skips to Paris into this part. So I'm not really sure if he's old enough to be a first-term congressman here, if he's the same character that he was in the first X-Men. I don't think that fully adds up. And then Holden swears that there is no agent killing Nazis in South America, but after he leaves the hearing, he orders his aide to contact Graves to see if this is true, because I want to know if I perjured myself on the floor of the United States Congress, is one of his lines. Eric treats his wounds, and we actually see him stitching himself up, I think, which is with his powers, which we would later see in Days of Future Past. But that's something I'm not saying they drew from this, because that seems like kind of an obvious thing to do if you have like a Magneto who's kind of on the run or something like that. And so Graves tells him that the mission has been called off because, he created too big of a stir. And so they debate this for a moment, and Eric shows distress over having killed that soldier and frustration over Graves being so willing to give up. And he eventually, he leaves for Israel because he doesn't know what else to do. And so after a brief moment where being in the crowd triggers memories of Auschwitz, he takes a cab. He gets off the plane in Israel, and what happens is that he's walking through the crowd, and suddenly he starts seeing, the people as they were in the camps surrounding him. Like, he sees them, he sees, like, people as they looked detained in the concentration camp, just in the place of the people in the crowd, and it's a really sort of visually striking moment. So he takes the cab to a convalescent home where he's learned his grandmother is staying, and her mind is gone though, and she doesn't remember him, which only makes Eric even more depressed and directionless. There's a nurse there who talks to him and tries to comfort him, and he says, "She can't remember and I can't forget," which is a good line sort of summing up, his relationship with his history in Auschwitz. And so we see Decker, who meets with Kleinmein in the park, but the doctor isn't happy to see him, saying they shouldn't meet like that. And Decker tells him that their South America operation has gotten rumbled, and how Eric took it down all by himself, and then Kleinmein tells Decker to take care of Eric and never to contact him like that again, as it's too risky. And so turns out we're in the city Haifa, in Israel, where Eric attends a kids' soccer game and there's one adult playing, and it turns out to be Charles Xavier, who he was the doctor on the card that was handed to him way back in the earlier scene. And so they talk, and Charles explains how he was a war photographer who was present during the liberation of Auschwitz, as well as how he was a psychiatric patient himself as a child who started hearing voices and lost his hair when he was 10. He says he learned to live with the voices, and now here he is. And of course, as Eric learns later, the voices are not mental illness, it's his telepathy, but at the time it was assumed he had mental illness, which is something which we pick up on again in Days of Future Past. And Charles gives Eric a tour of his institution, so in a class full of children, he says some are the children of Holocaust survivors, and some are the children of former Nazi guards, and he says that some of the attendants are former Nazis looking to make amends. And this disturbs Eric, who doesn't share Xavier's philosophy, because Xavier's idea is that he wants them to move on and integrate and sort of, put the past behind them. If people are willing to make amends, we should let them, and Eric just doesn't believe in that because he's Eric. And we're seeing these two meet, and we're already seeing their differences, which would eventually become, set in stone by the differences between the X-Men and the Brotherhood, as we see in the movies. And so he takes Eric to a bar and shows Charles news reports of atrocities on TV, which explains his cynicism. He mentions the evidence he found of practicing Nazis not operating in Israel as well. And then, before they can really talk about this, they then see three thugs hassling a deformed man in the bar. And when Charles fails to talk them down, they both take the thugs on in a fight and win. And this is where they really start to kind of become fond of each other and become friends. And so then we see Kleinmein experimenting on the now grown-up twins from Auschwitz, and he speaks to them, revealing that he's looking to create a superior race and fulfill Hitler's ambitions. And we then see Decker and an associate named Richter flying on the plane, which turns out to be landing soon in Israel. So they figured out where he is. I guess Eric's not very good at hiding. So Eric begins to tell Charles about his abilities when two Egyptian tanks burst across the border, and I have to point this out because I'm a geography major, I love maps, I have to point this out. Haifa is nowhere near the border with Egypt, and I know ever since the State of Israel was founded in 1948, the border has fluctuated, but even in 1956, Haifa was nowhere near the border with Egypt, not even close, so that makes no sense at all. And so they face them down together. Eric crushes one of his powers, and Charles makes the men inside the second tank exit it and flee. And, we also see Decker and Richter, they arrive in Israel, and they're preparing some explosives. And like Richter is looking around at all the Jewish people and says, "Too bad we couldn't bring more." So, yep, he's an asshole. I mean, he's a Nazi, so that kind of goes without saying, but, Charles explains to Eric, who thought that his powers were the results of the experimentation, that their gifts are part of them, brought out by times of great stress. And in this scene, like Eric says, he always knew he was different. Once again, doesn't gel with the whole, oh, they experimented on me and gave me these abilities. I'm not really sure why he thinks that when, once again, he always knew he was different, and he also, twisted the gate before he was ever experimented on, unless the trauma just screwed up his mind enough that his memories were kind of foggy until Xavier helps him, I guess. I don't know. And so the voices Charles heard as a child were people's thoughts, but he never uses his powers to control people, which Eric feels is him failing to embrace his abilities. Not all of us can control our powers. Then don't control them. Embrace them. Terrible apocalypse dialogue. Sorry, I had to say it. Also, while Eric is the first he's met in person, Charles has been tracking reports of anomalies, which seem to be increasing in number, particularly in the US, and he has this map of, map of the world on, the wall in, on a table in a room in the Institute, and he has red pins all over the place for these anomalies that he's tracking, and it's specifically described as, a low-tech precursor to Cerebro. That's the kind of call-forward prequel thing, which is actually a really cool idea. It's not too cute, it's not too obvious, it's not too silly. It actually works quite well as, a call-forward to something we would see in the future. And we already begin to see their differences in how they approach how mutants and humans should relate to one another, Eric seeing mutants as potential soldiers in a war. And so Eric hands Charles a notebook he found in Argentina, showing him the experiments that the Nazis have been performing on mutants, because he found that in the bunker. I forgot to take a note on that. And how they want to create a master race using them. Charles asks Eric for permission to read his mind, and he sees a jumble of memories, some happy, some sad, but a lot of it consists of glimpses of the barbaric experiments, as well as his first murder in Argentina. We also finally see what happened in Ukraine after his family died. Eric destroyed the village using poles and lights. Any bit of metal he can find, he just demolishes the village with it. Did he kill everybody in the village? I'm not sure. And wouldn't those technically be intentional murders? I'm really once again, I'm really doubting that one soldier that he guts was his first intentional murder. It's a little vague. It's one of those things that could be tweaked to make this better, but it's not a deal breaker or anything. And Charles is visibly horrified by this, and Eric tries to convince him to join the fight. And what I like about this is that he is just as horrified by what he's seen Eric done as what he has seen done to him, but Eric doesn't seem to even realize that. I think that's a really, interesting distinction between the characters. Charles doesn't believe in vengeance, so Eric says he'll be gone in the morning, but they part on good terms, as Eric still considers Charles a friend, and Charles still thinks Eric can be saved. And there's a janitor in the hallway. It turns out to be Richter, who's been following and watching Eric. And so that night in his room, Eric reads the Bible for comfort before tossing it away, finally done with it. And so this is him sort of, parting with his faith because it's not helping him. And earlier in Argentina, he was actually shown reading from the book of Job, which is interesting because that's a book in the Bible that's all about sort of the philosophy and the question of loss. And it doesn't actually give any easy answers to the question, which makes it really interesting to read. But it definitely shows that Turner is thinking about these things that he's putting in this script. It's not just random nonsense, at least as far as I can tell. It's a very interesting arc he goes on. And his faith isn't dwelt on. I like that it's there and then it erodes until he just finally just is done with it. I think that's an interesting idea. I think it's well handled. Next morning, he's up early and watching the sea from the nearby cliffs when he's approached by Decker and a henchman who never gets a name. They pull guns on Eric, and this is the one moment where his powers get way too cartoony for this script. Bends the barrel around to shoot the henchman and make the gun blow up, and destroying Decker's hand. Now, couldn't he have just yanked the gun and shot the guy, or bent the barrel on the one gun, then yanked the other gun and shot the other guy? Why is it suddenly turning into Looney Tunes? I don't understand. That's totally a Looney Tunes move, right? That wouldn't even work. The bullet wouldn't travel through the barrel if it was bent like that. At least I don't think it would. And I know I'm saying this in a script based on comics, but I don't think that's how that would work. And so he then straps, Decker into the Jeep they drove in and tries to make him tell him where Kleinmine is, to which Decker replies they won't get to the doctor because they won't let him. And then Eric finds the boarding pass in his pocket and is shocked by the information on it. And even though he's distracted, he uses his powers to make the Jeep roll towards the cliff. And then Decker uses his distraction to tell Richter to do it now over his pocket radio. And Eric figures out what must be going on and runs towards the Institute as the Jeep goes over the cliff and Decker dies in a horrible explosion. Good riddance. And I believe, Decker was the guy who had the helmet crushed onto his head in Auschwitz. So at the Institute, Charles, with his powers, he senses what Richter is about to do and suddenly orders everyone to evacuate. And he manages to get everyone out just before the bombs go off. But Richter gets out too, but Eric spots him and throws him back into the exploding building with a wheelchair. Fucking awesome image. Because it's like one because it's like set up as like multiple explosions that go off in sequence, and like he gets out after the first explosion and Eric yanks a wheelchair over, shoves him into it, and just goes boom into the second explosion. That's just so cool. Eric and Charles, they talk while surveying the rubble, and Charles insists that this is a time to mourn. And Eric says he's going after them with or without Charles and leaves him the boarding pass, which reveals that Klein Mine is located in Washington, D.C. What a twist. So yeah, this is basically, an Operation Paperclip thing, kind of like what they did with what the fuck's the character's name again? Zola in Winter Soldier, how he got picked up by the Americans and, worked for them in their science stuff and helped Hydra infiltrate, actually. So Klein Mine, he's shown arriving at his DC townhouse where he meets with Holden and Graves. And so yes, the twist is that Graves was in on this all along. Now I have questions about this because this is never addressed. If Graves was involved in Klein Mine's operation in America all along, why was he helping Charles hunt down Nazis, and why was he complicit in helping Charles destroy the South American operation? Now, he didn't know about that, but at the same time, why would he even help him get close and send him after Decker's associates? The only things I can think of is that he thought Grubowski was a loose end and wanted to get rid of him, or he didn't even know about the operation in South America. He just knew there were Nazis there and actually wanted to get rid of him, and he doesn't know how evil Klein Mine actually is. That's possible, but it's a little muddled, and that's another thing you could fix in a future draft. And so he tells them that he knows Eric is coming for him and that the formula to create a super soldier using the mutant gene is complete. And this sends Holden into high alert as he doesn't want Eric jeopardizing his new weapon. So he orders ports and airports watched, but Graves assures him that Eric will come to them. And then so Eric, we see him sneaking past soldiers watching the airport, chaining a bunch of them in the back of a truck, which he drives away. And we see Klein Mine. He orders his underlings to start clearing out the lab in preparation to vacate the premises. And he takes his formula from his safe, and it's implied that he's keeping it for the Fourth Reich, like he was never planning on actually handing this over to the U.S. government. So maybe they didn't actually know about the operation in South America. That's very possible. But once again, it could be clarified a bit more. And then we see some of his mutant test subjects, including mutants that look like younger versions of Sabretooth and Mystique. And they're kept in glass tubes or cages in the lab. And there's another one who's he is referred to as a hirsute beast. And of course, hirsute means furry. I don't know if that's actually referring to Beast or if that's implying that he might be Beast. I'm not positive on that score, but it is definitely implying that these are young versions of Sabretooth and Mystique, setting up for them to be in his brotherhood in the trilogy. But he's probably being vague about those two just in case, other movies wanted to use them for stuff, as First Class ended up doing, and, X-Men Origins, Wolverine, and all that. But then again, Fox has never really cared about contradicting the X-Men movies, so, not like it would have mattered. And so Graves and his family, they're visiting the zoo when Eric confronts him and separates. He drags him off. And so they gets him to walk away, and they argue over the morality of sheltering Klein Mine, with Graves saying that his science could save countless lives, while Eric maintains that they're only helping the Nazi cause. And what I like about this argument is that Graves actually makes a few fairly decent points here. It's still horrible that they're sheltering who's basically this universe's version of Dr. Mengele. But, when he's arguing, they let him make good arguments, whether you agree with them or not. I think that's a sign of good writing. And so Eric then notices that the zoo has emptied of tourists and is ambushed by agents and cops who surround him and restrain him with flex cuffs, or the 1956 equivalent, as it says in the script. Now, I actually did this research, and flex cuffs were not, zip cuffs basically, were not actually introduced until 1965, so I'm not sure that works. Maybe, they had a classified prototype on hand or something. That could be possible, but, it's a bit of a stretch. And so as they're leading him out through the zoo, Eric uses his powers to open the zoo cages, letting the animals out, and he then sets off a cop's gun to startle them, which impedes their progress through the zoo, and Graves is just shoot anything that gets in the way, and I'm like, wow. So they get out of the zoo and they attempt to take Eric away in the car, only for him to control it and make it crash into a fire hydrant. Graves pulls him out and he requisitions the cop and has him drive them away in a different car. But it turns out that the cop is Charles, who has come to help Eric, and they get the location of Klein Mine from Graves, whom they leave cuffed outside a police station. Now, when I first read this, I did question how did Eric find Charles, but he knew he was... How did Charles find Eric, I should say? But thinking about it, he knew he was going to Washington, and he probably was able to track him psychically speaking through the city, so that's that. It doesn't really need an explanation. And interspersed through all of this, we see more frantic packing at Kleinmein's lab as he injects his formula into the twins and the mutant enclosures. He like flips a switch and they start slowly being filled with water so he can just drown his experiments because he doesn't have any more use for them. Charles and Eric, they approach the farm in Virginia where Kleinmein's lab is located, and we also see a detachment of soldiers heading for the same location to protect it. Eric enters what's referred to as a farmhouse, but described as a barn, so yeah, it doesn't really he kind of screwed up the descriptions there, where he finds the entrance to an underground bunker. Meanwhile, Eric notices a helicopter flying a team of soldiers. No, Charles, I miswrote this in the notes. Charles notices a helicopter flying a team of soldiers and makes the convoy of approaching army trucks crash and pile up by making a herd of deer flock into the road. So, no horses here, but, deer, like in The Ring 2, I guess. So, Charles controlling animals here is, a bit of a call forward to Logan again. Eric moves through the bunker where he gets trapped by Kleinmein in a room with no metal, where he gets savagely beaten by the twins. Then after a while, Kleinmein enters and attempts to euthanize the seemingly docile Eric, but he yanks the syringe away and stabs one of the twins in the neck with it, killing him. He punches Kleinmein in the nose, breaking it, I guess, and the doctor flees, leaving Eric to deal with the second twin. And it's now Charles enters the bunker as well, and after fighting one straggling scientist, he uses his powers on him, finds the room with the glass enclosures filling with water. So, okay, when Eric was entering the bunker, either he saw the glass enclosures filling with water and just completely ignored them to go on his vengeance streak. Charles walked into the bunker, saw Eric getting his ass kicked, and decided to leave him to it. So either way, these two kind of come off kind of dumb here. And so Eric continues to fight the enraged second twin, eventually opening a door to another room, impaling him with the surgical tools that were in there, and then in the hallway, the soldiers have now entered the bunker, and Eric collapses the ceiling to bar their way. And Charles, he finds the room with the glass enclosures, I forgot to mention. He uses his powers to shatter the glass and saves a number of them. And it's mentioned also that that they're almost dead, and there's a girl who has gills, and so she's okay. But I have to point out that Xavier does not have telekinesis he has telepathy as a power, not telekinesis, so he can't move objects with his mind, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You'd have to change that. And so Charles takes the rescued mutants and flees, while Eric goes after Kleinmein, who's escaping in a car. And so Eric stands in the road, gets Kleinmein to speed the car at him, only to step out of the way at the last minute and make him crash into a tree. Now, I would prefer if Eric used his powers to yank the car and make it crash into the tree, because that's a little silly what he does there. But Eric is watching as Kleinmein is about to burn to death, and he's got the vial in his hand, and he reaches in, crushes the hand around the vial, so just tortures him a little bit, and then he turns and walks away as Kleinmein's dying screams fill the air. And Kleinmein actually has the audacity to beg Eric for help in this sequence. Seriously, dude? You want this guy to help you? After all you've done or tried to do to him? You're giving him shit about this? Wow. But that's a pretty satisfying, horrific death, just hearing him scream in agony. And then Charles, he pulls up in a stolen military truck with the rescued mutants in back, and Eric swears that the crash killed Kleinmein, but it's implied that Charles is having his doubts. And so 2 weeks later, Charles and Eric, they purchase a plot of land to build a new institute on, which will become the Xavier School. So the institute in Haifa is used as sort of a prototype idea of the Xavier School, where it will be about teaching mutants how to use their powers and to live in harmony with the rest of humanity, building on his work with Holocaust survivors and the children of Nazis. Very interesting and powerful parallel, I think. And Eric, he reuses his line from earlier where he says, "I'm good with construction," so it leaves open the implication for a sequel here. And then it shows him, and we see Eric in an apartment constructing his helmet and wearing it for the first time. So this is him truly sort of taking on the identity of Magneto. Now, I have questions about this past story here. If the CIA was gung-ho about capturing Eric, how is he able to just live in America fine unless, they decided, hey, let's not mess with this guy? It's not really explained. And also, we're setting up for what could be a first-class movie when you think about it, because they have Sabretooth, Mystique, and other mutants that have been rescued, and that they're going to presumably, teach at the school. That kind of leads into a potential first-class movie, so that just really makes me think you could have done the Magneto movie and then done a first-class movie, a version of First Class, with the Magneto stuff having already been taken care of in the previous movie, and the continuity would have been better preserved, I take it. So yeah. So yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about. And so it cuts back to the framing device, and Charles meets Eric at Auschwitz, and he talks to him about, humanity's capacity for change. And then Senator Kelly appears before the crowd and uses the event to go into an anti-mutant speech. And Eric promises that Charles will see him again soon. As he leaves, he twists the gate again, and that's where it ends. So this is supposed to be before the X-Men. This seems like it would be immediately before the first X-Men movie. And it's just weird because it seems to be like almost too similar to the opening of X-Men 1, because in that scene, you have Senator Kelly giving his big anti-mutant speech. And then they have a conversation, like, away from the crowd together, which is basically the same conversation they have here about how people can change and evolve and all that. And of course, Eric doesn't buy into it, so it seems kind of repetitive of that scene. So if you tried to watch these in chronological order, you would get serious whiplash. But yeah, that was, about Senator Kelly, I want to read his speech, because I don't think this works. Because he was really gung-ho about finding Nazis, and he gives this speech at the end where he says, "We must learn from the mistakes of the past, we must never forget. Here we stand faced with another dangerous threat at our doorstep, a vicious breed of evil manifesting across the land, an evil not seen since the Nazis. If we don't learn from the past, if we don't learn from this, then we'll be standing at the threshold of another genocide, perpetuated by a nefarious breed we've come to call mutants." How do you go from Nazis are bad to let's discriminate against people in the same speech? I don't get it. Like, this would make way more sense if he say this Kelly is like Robert Kelly Jr. and the one we saw earlier was Robert Kelly Sr. and he can be, my dad saved me from, helped with, the Nazi threat, and then he helped us against the communists and bring up the Red Scare or something like that, and I want to follow in his footsteps. That would make more sense than this. I don't feel like his logic there quite adds up. But yeah, on the whole, X-Men Origins Wolverine's a piece of shit. X-Men Origins Magneto was a really good script, and I think Sheldon Turner did a great job on this. And it's not perfect, like I said, there's some logic issues, there's some things that don't quite add up. Xavier is not telekinetic, he's telepathic. But I think this could have been a very damn good movie if they would have made this. Like, get a real strong actor to play young Magneto, like, probably wouldn't have been Fassbender when they first started working on this, but it would have been a great movie to see, and I really wish this would have been made. As much as I like First Class, the Magneto stuff is definitely the strongest stuff, and the stuff with the actual First Class is the weaker part in the movie. Like, it's still good, it's just not as good as the Magneto stuff. But I would have loved to have seen this. The reason it didn't happen, it seems like that they were waiting to do it, to pull the trigger until after X-Men Origins Wolverine came out, and that underperformed. It did well in the opening weekend, but it had a steep drop-off, so it didn't do as well as they wanted it to do, and it was widely reviled. Nobody wanted to make that movie, really, except for Tom Rothman. The whole thing was his idea. Like, Lauren Schuler Donner didn't want it, Hugh Jackman didn't want it, Gavin Hood didn't want it. Like, it was basically a movie they were forced to make when they really wanted to do the Japan story. And so the reception to that, I think, just kind of poisoned the well for any sort of movies called X-Men Origins, and because this had been under that same umbrella, it didn't get the same amount of, it probably just got swept under the rug because of that. Now, as far as the First Class connections go, that does have Magneto hunting Nazis and going after the scientist who experimented on him. Now, and Sheldon Turner did get a story credit on that thanks to the WGA, but if you ask Matthew Vaughn and Jane Goldman says that they just, it was, similar parallel ideas they came up with them on their own. She says it's an idea that you could come up with on your own. It was possible to come up with it independently. Matthew Vaughn's version was that the WGA were being fuckwits. That's his words, not mine. And that they wrote it themselves. So yeah, that's a whole thing. I don't know who to believe on that. Like, certain things, but I mean, the whole structure of it does feel like it was transferred in the First Class. Who knows really what the story is? Like, we'll never know unless we read, like, First Class drafts or treatments and stuff like that. Like, we'll never know. Although I'm still convinced that Kinberg just yanked the family stuff from this and put it into Apocalypse for no real reason. Just to give Magneto an arc. But yeah, X-Men Origins Magneto, this is one of my favorite unproduced superhero scripts. It's unconventional, it has a really bleak, serious tone to it, it's a great character piece, and it would have made a great companion piece to the X-Men movies. It would have been a better X-Men Origins movie than X-Men Origins Wolverine. I almost forgot to mention this, I can't believe it, but Magneto and Xavier saving a bunch of young mutants from a lab that's been experimenting on them. Almost the exact same climax as X-Men Origins Wolverine. Now, that was not in the early script that I read for that episode, so I don't know at what point that came in, because no other drafts of that script have ever surfaced. I don't know at what point that climax came into that movie, but maybe they looked at this script and, I like that, and went yoink, dunk. And maybe that affected, why they were putting this off. Now, granted, David Goyer directing this, it might have turned out bad because he's not a good director, but this is a solid enough script that maybe that wouldn't be too big of a problem. But yeah, X-Men Origins Wolverine, like I said, it's one of my favorite scripts. It's got a great tone. It's got a great story to it, great character stuff. It would have, been a nice companion piece to the X-Men movies, and I really wish it had been made. So yeah. That was this episode, and until next time, guys, which is going to be the team episode, bye!